Welcome to another talk as part of our Understanding 2 conference. I am very grateful that our next speaker, Daniel Wilkenfeld, has joined us for Understanding 2. Daniel was here for Understanding 1 as well, the bridges between the epistemology and phenomenology of understanding. This was in May of this year. And once again, just as I did with David, I will say something embarrassing about Daniel as well. One of the other first papers I read about understanding was authored by Daniel, and this was the muddy approach to understanding, the many understanding dimensions. And it was absolutely golden. That's where I found something I thought was actually true, that understanding was connected with explanation, with truth, with coherence, with predictive power, with problem-solving abilities, with so many other dimensions of understanding that are absolutely crucial. And maybe they just trade each other off without some kind of, any single one of them being a kind of overarching and principled necessary condition. So Daniel, thanks again for that. Tonight, I believe that we will be talking about understanding necessarily and understanding actually. Daniel, is there anything I could do with respect to the slides? Okay, perfect.
I'm having a little bit of technical trouble, but I've almost got it figured out. First of all, thank you for your kind words. Are you, one second, let me switch this. You should be seeing the main slides now, is that correct?
We're seeing the introductory slide, that's right.
Great, okay, not the, perfect. Okay, oops. So this is about understanding what's actually happened, being understanding necessary, this claims of necessity. This paper is in a very weird place right now. So it's in the middle of an R&R, and one referee said to accept, and one referee said to just like outright reject. Given the crowd here, they could both be in this room. So it'll be interesting to see how people react. So as a result, it needs very massive revisions, but I have gotten some positive feedback that there's at least a kernel of a good idea here. So I'd be curious what to think. I don't know I'm going to go the full hour since this is still a work in progress. And for those of you who've never seen me present before, I am autistic, so I will randomly stare off into space just because I don't want to make eye contact, but even with the screen. So please don't take offense if I do that during your questions or think I'm not paying attention. Okay, so the big question that I'm thinking about is, and maybe it's not a big question about anyways, is what's the link between understanding why an event had to happen and understanding why it actually did happen? And specifically, if you can go from just understanding necessity to understanding actuality, and I'll talk more about what I mean in a second. Now, obviously, understanding that an event had to happen logically entails that it did happen, but that by itself is not enough to show us that we understand why it did happen, because just, you know, the fact that A entails B and we understand A is not enough to understand B. I mean, if for no other reason, you might think that not B because you're really bad at logic. And that would be a weird way to understand why B if you don't think that B is even true. Or if you don't even have, for those of you who read you don't have to believe that B is true. If you don't even have any positive credence that's true, you actively think the contradiction. So just the fact that you might think it's really easy to understand necessarily, you understand why it actually happened because the former entails the latter, but I think it's a little more complicated than that. Now, I'd like to place this in a bit of a dialectic, which I'm not going to totally solve, but which I think is important. And a lot of this comes out of a paper, I think it was 2009, by Peter Lipton, where what he's ultimately arguing for is that there could be understanding without explanation. And I think it's in the Direct and Deeks volume, but I'm not 100% sure on that. His idea, he gives various examples where he thinks there's understanding without explanation. One of them that I'm going to focus on is where you show something's necessary, and in so doing, you show, he thinks you gain understanding without explanation. And the example he gives is Galileo's famous thought experiment, where the question is whether objects fall in proportion to their mass or independently of their mass. And Galileo points out, if you assume they fall proportionately to their mass, you raise the question, what happens if you tie a really, did I freeze? Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah, we
now.
can.
Oh,
Yeah.
weird. My video froze on my end. So let me know if there's a problem, because I froze in my little corner. But if you guys are good, I'm good.
Sure thing.
So if you tie, I'm sure this is all familiar to pretty much everyone in this room. If you tie a very heavy object to a very light object, on the one hand, the fusion is heavier or more massive, so it should fall faster. On the other hand, you could think of the light object as acting as or the less massive object as acting on a brake, because it should be going slower. So the fusion should go slower. So since it has to go slower and faster, you've reached a contradiction. So your original hypothesis that they fall at a rate proportionate to their mass had to be false. So clearly they fall independently of their mass at a rate, ignoring obviously air resistance, that sort of thing, as Galileo does. So Lipton says that's an example of understanding without explanation. And specifically, I'm going to use a variable here. We know this because Galileo, that thought experiment, lets us understand something without having an explanation of it. But people have argued over what exactly it is we understand as a result of Galileo's thought experiment. So you could think why two objects necessarily fall at the same rate, which is what it seems to show. But then do you actually have understanding without an explanation of an actual event? So do you really understand something physical about why these two balls I'm dropping fall at the same rate if all you have is the necessity claim? And it seems like that's not what he showed. But if you really want an example of understanding something happening in the world without explanation.
Daniel, can you hear us?
Okay, great. So again, my sincere apologies. I have no idea what happened. So Lipton says there can be understanding without explanation. We know that. Okay, good. So here's my thesis, and I might actually change it in a way. And I am traveling today, which is why I'm missing most of the other talks, but which is a shame because I gather the last one was on grasping, which is important to this. Here is my current version of the thesis. Understanding why E must be true for reason R is sometimes sufficient for understanding why E actually is true, and that sometimes I know is frustrating. So here is sort of a more official version to spell out that sometimes. Understanding of necessity is sufficient for understanding actuality when the understander grasps both the necessity claim itself and the connection between the necessity and the real world. Now, I'm a little anxious about that grasping relation. One other possibility I'm toying with is to get rid of grasping talk entirely and use understanding that talk as a more fundamental notion. This is a move Strevens uses in his 2013 paper, which he argues isn't circular because understanding that, we don't care about understanding why or maybe understanding how. So maybe I can use something like understanding that and say, get rid of the grasping talk and say, understanding of necessity is sufficient for understanding actuality when the understander understands both the necessity claim itself and the connection between the necessity and the real world. So I don't know whether to do it in terms of grasping or some more fundamental notion of understanding, but that's the idea, is you get the necessity claim, you get the connection, and that's enough to understand the actuality claim. Okay, here are some examples of what I'm talking about. There's the Galileo one, which I think is a case, and we're going to be talking about different kinds of necessity because I think it might make a difference. That seems to be a case of metaphysical necessity. The case Lipton gives is the case of two boxers, which I'm going to talk more about. Here's the example Lipton another example lift and give. So there are two boxers, Abel and Baker. Baker, the fight is rigged. Baker is scheduled to take a dive in the 10th round. But before it comes to that, Abel, who is the less good boxer, lands a lucky punch and floors Baker in the 5th. Lipton argues that as long as we know that Baker was scheduled to dive, we understand that Baker lost because he had to lose. So we know he had to lose. We get the wrong mechanism. We think it's because he's going to take a dive. He actually just loses by chance. Lipton claims we still understand why Baker actually lost. And it's not clear what type of necessity that is, which I'm going to actually get back to because I think it's kind of important. And here's my personal favorite. It's from an XKCD What If webcomic, which I just love, and I've actually referred to in other papers, which is the question of whether you can start a fire from moonlight with a giant magnifying glass. And there's a complicated reason you can't, having to do with, I think it's the conservation of Ventudine, which I don't even know how to say. But here's the simple way I don't know whether you want to call it an explanation, but to me, he conveys understanding, which is that lenses and mirrors work for free. They don't take energy to operate. If you could use lenses and mirrors to make heat flow from the sun to a spot on the ground that's hotter than the sun, you'd be making heat flow from a colder place to a hotter place without expending energy. The second law of thermodynamics says you can't do that. And more specifically, I think the quote uses the sun, but the case he's worried about is, could you use the moonlight to start a fire? And the answer is no, it cannot be done no matter how good your lens is. And I think that's going to be a case of physical necessity because it's entailed by the second law of thermodynamics when that's interpreted as absolute, which we'll get back to. That's the sort of part. Okay, so why does Galileo help us understand? I mean, to really do this, I need to go through all accounts of understanding, or at least all plausible accounts. And in fact, one of the reviewers said I should do more, which is probably fair. But here are just some reasons, just thinking about understanding, why understanding the necessity claim lets me understand why these two physical objects are going to fall at the same rate, even though they have different mass. So I think what Galileo shows us is a metaphysical dependency, which if Jaegwon Kim argued in 1994 is crucial to understanding. It's like causation, but it's a broader notion. And I think this one's kind of a freebie, that what you're understanding is a dependency claim. So if Jaegwon Kim is right, then I think we understand a necessity claim. That's some sort of the logical dependency. I think, and this is potentially arguable for those of you who know my current account of understanding, where understanding is a matter of helping us compress information. I think there's a lot of information we don't need to carry around about specific objects falling if we know a more general claim about all balls falling, or all objects falling. The trick is that claim that I just said necessarily true? Probably not, but it will at least show that a lot of the times the understanding the necessity claim suffices for understanding the actuality claim. I think it unifies for the same reason. We need to remember fewer specific claims about individual objects if we have the necessity claim, which is presumably broader. Direct is tricky again, this is so fast, I'm sorry. So for those of you who know his landmark theory, understanding a phenomenon is when you can explain it from an intelligible theory. An intelligible theory critically is one where you can see qualitative consequences without doing calculations. And I think that's really clear here. The theory of why you can easily see without doing any calculations what's going to happen when you drop these two balls. If, again, you don't care about air resistance, you just care about their mass. So I think what you have by his account is a very intelligible theory. Now, whether you actually understand the phenomenon, he says the theory has to explain the phenomenon, in which case you still get that you understand it, but it wouldn't be any help to Lipton because we'd already need explanation. I've argued elsewhere that Derek's talk of explanation could be sort of you can circumvent it if you really try. He disagrees with me. But I think you could get around it. And even if you can't, it still establishes the point that I'm technically arguing for, though it does it in a way that undermines Lipton's broader argument. It can be used in an argument for why something had to happen, given laws, conditions, etc. I think this one's pretty clear. This is obviously the DN. What Hempel says about understanding, or what he says about understanding, is basically what he says about explanation. You understand when you know the line is why something had to happen. And here you know why it had to happen. You don't even need any initial conditions or boundary conditions. And you might not even need any natural laws, which would be an interesting result. So yeah, it's a little different because you don't not even need a natural law, but I think it captures the spirit of what Hempel says, which is you understand why something occurred when you know why it had to occur. Now, again, these are ones that undermine Lipton, but also accounts that are based on explanation, that characterize explanation in terms of understanding. I think if you look at what I have above, Friedman and Kitcher on unification, Hempel on explanation, put a pin in causal explanation for now, which I'll get back to in a second. I think these can be used as an explanation, but of course that doesn't help Lipton. And in fact, it might actually hurt him. I'm still working on integrating other accounts of understanding. If people have thoughts on that. For those who don't know, I'm in a nursing school now, so I've been working mostly on ethics lately, so I'm a little behind the cutting edge. So I'm doing a lot of catching up. So if people say like, no, Daniel, according to the most recent cutting edge account, you're wrong. That would be interesting to know. I'm doing some panicky reading right now of everything that's come out in the last year. Okay, why would you think this doesn't help us understanding these necessity claims? What's the worry? And I think Khalifa in his 2017 book, which is phenomenal, talks about understanding. He's a friend of mine, so I'm biased, but it's phenomenal anyway. Understanding as sort of aspiring to the condition of what scientists do, and he has a very well worked out account of that. And that isn't, you could argue this isn't the way scientists function. Khalifa is only interested in scientific explanation or scientific understanding. I'm interested in a broader notion. That if you've read my work, that's a sort of recurring theme, is I think following Woodward that it would be cool if we could get an account of understanding that applied to common day, everyday understanding. I also think it would be cool if we could apply it to like people and artworks. So how does this work with the magnifying glass example, which is scientific? Would scientists really use that sort of explanation? It doesn't fit Khalifa's model. But at the beginning of his book, I don't think his model is supposed to be exhaustive. There's all sorts of types of understanding it doesn't include, and this might be one of those. It doesn't show us any difference makers because there are no difference makers. This is Strevin's account of depth from 2008, later elaborated upon, and I think that's okay. And this is going to be critical because Strevins is explicitly only interested in causal explanation. And I'm not claiming causal understanding. I'm sorry, that should be causal understanding. And this is very much not causal. That's crucial, is that because these are necessity claims, they're not causal. So they're not going to work out well in models of causal understanding, but that's okay because there are other kinds of understanding, which I'll argue for in just a second, but I've always thought it's kind of obvious. So, I mean, the general lesson is when you open the playbook of different possible kinds of understanding to allow different possibilities, I think Galileo does generate understanding of why these two particular objects fall. Now, getting back to what I just tabled a second ago, you might think understanding is causal, and there isn't a causal story here. The thought experiment doesn't show why they fall at the same rate. You need something like general relativity for that. So what's going on? And even that wouldn't be causal. I don't know what a causal story would look like here. So it's true that this isn't causal, but I think to claim that all understanding is causal is just on the surface, not plausible. People talk about sometimes causal understanding as if it's the only kind. I'm not sure anyone ever commits to it being, and people do sometimes commit to it, but I think it's just clearly not. I think there's understanding in mathematics. And if you, I mean, just intuitively, these are all necessary truths. So, I mean, things in math don't cause, they're explanatory proofs in math. There's proofs you can understand in math, but the proof doesn't cause anything to be true. I mean, how that works is a good question. Obviously, I'm sure people here know much more about understanding in math than I do. But it doesn't seem like it's causal. Same thing with philosophy. It seems like we can understand why utilitarianism is true or why it's false, but without knowing a causal story necessarily of what makes it true or false. And Kareem, and I contributed slightly to this paper, is working on a paper about, about things about dynamical explanation and computational understanding. I don't want to touch those right now, but arguably they're not causal as well. But I don't want to talk about those because they're a little above my pay grade. Okay, so here's sort of my big picture central argument, combining a few of the things I just said. So T is just my general thesis about how understanding necessity can suffice under the right conditions for understanding actuality, which is that if an account allows for non-causal explanations and understanding, then my theory is true, my thesis is true. This follows from accounts of understanding and from examinations of examples. If an account allows for non-causal explanations and understanding, but then sets them aside, which I think like Strevens might do, then that account isn't applicable in these cases. So sure, it doesn't provide that kind of understanding, but maybe it provides a different kind of understanding that they're not talking about. So sure, this isn't Strevens style difference makers, but that's fine because he explicitly says he's only talking about one subset of understanding. And then I think, it falls out of their realm entirely because, I mean, obviously I'm not going to get into what causation requires, but it's probably some sort of counterfactual variability, and you're not going to get that here because it's not a good equivalent of explanans for understanding, but the things that help you understand are necessary, so you're not going to find counterfactual variation. So it's not going to be causal. So if your account of understanding is just limited to causal understanding, but you acknowledge there are other kinds, well, this will be one of the other kinds, and that's okay. Or you could claim that account does not allow for non-causal explanations and understanding, but then I think your account's just extensionally inadequate because you're going to run into trouble with math and philosophy and maybe computational and other types of understanding. But I just focus on math and philosophy. Okay, let's get back to the boxing example because I think it's kind of interesting. So if you'll recall, Baker was scheduled to take a fall in the 10th, but he actually gets knocked out by a lucky punch in the 5th round. Lipton says we intuitively understand why Baker lost because we understand that he had to lose. Michael Hanan comes along and says, no, we don't understand why he lost. You're just wrong. And I actually really love this because like in all, whatever, 18 years I've been studying philosophy, just the your intuition is wrong move is so rare that I like admire Michael's guts here. So, and I'm actually indirectly going to agree with Michael on this one. He says, no, you don't understand why he lost. He lost because of the lucky punch. He didn't lose because he had to lose. And I think, how do we settle this contrast of intuitions? Well, we could always do some XFi, but I'm not going to do that. I'd rather reach sort of a rapprochement of intuitions. And what I'm going to end up saying is that Hanan is right about this particular case, but that I can come up with a new case that recaptures Lipton's intuition. And the reason I think Lipton's intuition can't be right in this case, we don't understand why Baker really lost, is because he's also misdescribing his own case, because Baker didn't really have to lose. This isn't really a case of necessity. Like, Abel could have changed his mind and lost. And given that, I mean, I realize this is like an undergrad move, like pointing out that there's a, that the case is set up in a way that's not really plausible. So maybe I'm just cheating and denying the stipulation, but the stipulation doesn't make sense here. So Abel could have, so we don't have a necessity claim at all. And we certainly don't understand why he lost because he had to lose, because he didn't have to lose. Like, things could have gone differently. But I think if we tweak the case where Baker really did have to lose, then I think we can recapture Lipton's original intuition that we understand why Baker lost because we understand that he had to lose. So this is my own case. Which I call divine boxing. Suppose it was in the nature of an omnipotent God that Baker had to lose. Baker was a sinner. He was not entitled to this victory. God's nature decrees Baker really does have to lose this match as a matter of necessity. For this case to work, I don't want it to be causal. So I don't want God to operate as a decision maker, that God sat there and decided that Baker had to lose in the traditional sense. It's just Baker had to lose. That's just in the nature of God. And we can talk about theology if people really want, but I think this is one way of approaching it. Obviously, I'm not saying this is how theology works. So now I think we do understand. So suppose this is the case. Baker really did have to lose. It was in the nature of the universe that Baker was going to lose. It was fated in a very strict sense. Then I think saying, why did Baker lose? He always had to. That really does seem to generate understanding. And again, I don't want an intuition monger here, but I think my proof of this here is if this intuition, my intuition here isn't right, then none of Greek tragedy makes any sense. Where the interesting upshot is, no, this happened because it was fated to happen in, 4 out of 5 Greek tragedies. That would be significantly less interesting if that didn't grant understanding into why Oedipus ended up doing various horrible things. Okay, I want to get back to the fires from Moonlight because I think it's a really interesting case of physical necessity. So for this to be a necessity claim in the first place, so for it to fall under my sort of overall question, we have to imagine for the moment, and I'll get back to this, that the second law is absolute rather than statistical. So entropy really never decreases. We're using the old school version of the second law. Now, of course, strictly speaking, that's not true. It is possible to start a fire from moonlight. It's just ridiculously unlikely. Like, things could just go through the lens and get significantly hotter. That's just not going to happen in the lifetime of the universe. But if it weren't absolute, then we wouldn't understand why. So the question here is, suppose I'm sitting here with my magnifying glass in the moonlight trying to start a fire and it's not working. And I'm trying to understand why it's not working. And Randall Munro comes along, he's the writer of XKCD, and says you can't do that, it would violate the second law of thermodynamics. Now, if the second law we don't take as absolute, then it's true that I don't understand really why this isn't working, but that's because I have a false belief. He said that this couldn't work, but it really could work, it just won't. So there's no interesting lesson there. There might be a contextual parameter, whether we're considering counterfactuals where entropy can increase, whether we're taking that possibility seriously. And I think either way, the case either becomes, either we don't understand because we have a false belief, or we do understand for the same reason that we understood in the Galileo case, because necessity is providing for actuality, or is letting us grasp what's happening actually, according to various accounts of understanding. So if the second law, if we're, for whatever reason, thinking of the second law in terms of something that could be violated, then we don't understand, but that doesn't conflict with my thesis because it's not necessary. And if we're thinking of it absolute, then we do understand, and that works out great. So what are some possible upshots here? So I think we've expanded accounts that table non-causal, non-scientific understanding to domains dealing with necessary truths. So if you were a fan of Strevens and you wondered like, hey, what do we think about other types of understanding? I think this gives some insight. I think I've recaptured Hanan's intuition that understanding shows why something had to happen without, oh, sorry, Hempel's intuition. I think I've recaptured some of Hempel's intuition that understanding shows why something had to happen sometimes, but I didn't have to rely on his particular formalisms. It's not always the case, but I think I've recovered a lot of obviously the most important works in the philosophy of understanding. So I think if we can sort of recapture insights from Hempel now that it's been mostly overthrown. I know one philosopher off the top of my head who's still a DN theorist, but now that it's mostly been overthrown, but like there was clearly had something going for it, given how long it was taken. So I've sort of recaptured some of this idea that understanding why something had to happen is potentially crucial sometimes to understanding why it did happen. So that's really the heart of the talk. One thing that I'm speculating on, which I just want to do for fun, is whether what I've just said has any implication for whether non-constructive proofs provide understanding. So here's an example, probably 90% of you know it. So a non-constructive proof is in mathematics is a proof where you show that something, so for example, an existential claim has to be true, but you don't have a witness for it. You don't show which particular thing it's true of. So here's sort of the, 11th grade example for those of you who didn't do it or don't remember. So here's a question. Is it possible to take an irrational number to the power of an irrational number and get a rational number as a result? So it's super easy to prove that it's possible, but it's much harder to figure out which two provably irrational numbers it works for. And just for fun, for those of you who didn't see it or don't remember, just because an easy math proof is always fun. Here's the easy proof. So if you take the square root to the square root of 2 is really easy to prove as irrational. If you take square root of 2 to the power of the square root of 2, it's either irrational or rational. But let's just suppose for the moment we don't know which. If it's rational, the answer, then we're done, because we took an irrational number to the power of an irrational number and got a rational number. So we proved it could be done. If we suppose it's irrational, just take that irrational number and take it to the power of the square root of 2, which is once again very easy to prove as irrational. And just some simple arithmetic shows you that that equals 2. It becomes the square root of 2 squared, which equals 2. So we have two irrational numbers, one to the power of the other, and we get a rational number. And so we're done. So we've proven this. That was as nice as math proofs get. But you'll notice we don't know which is the real example. I can prove to you that there is an irrational number to the power of an irrational number that gets you a rational number, but I haven't told you which two irrational numbers it is, because I don't know if the square root of 2 to the square root of 2 is irrational. We actually do now know it's irrational, but that proof is much harder. So just pretend we don't, or go back enough years that we didn't know that. So here's a question. How can we understand the truth of the claim that we take two irrationals to get a rational if we can't even say which of two numbers they are? And here's a very speculative hypothesis. Maybe what the easy proof shows is that it has to be true that we can take one irrational number to the power of another and get a rational number. And knowing that it has to be true based on the sort of logic I've given today, having to do with the concept of understanding, explains why it is true, even though we can't actually point to what makes it true in particular, which two numbers. Now, I should flag that the intuitionist logician might deny that we even know that it has to be true. So I apologize to any intuitionist logicians out there for if I've offended you. And that's really all I had to talk about. Sorry if that was a little bit short, but I'd be happy to chat, take any questions, etc.
Daniel, thank you so much. This has been absolutely instructive. I'm sure everyone in the audience joins me in using the applause button. Thanks again. And this would be the ideal time to raise questions and provide comments for Professor Wilkenfeld's talk. And if you'd like to signal that either by a virtual hand or by making yourselves known in chat, that would be terrific. Okay, I'm just gonna break the, oh, I see David has a question. David, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks for the talk, Daniel. I'm just wondering, so I'm looking at the thesis here, and I'm wondering, so you say that understanding why E must be true, for some reason R is sometimes sufficient for understanding why E is true. I'm wondering if you want as a further condition, I mean, to guarantee it's sufficient, that you actually know the reason. Like the reason can't be made up, right? If it's, you know, if I can, I'm wondering whether, you know, why E is the case, and if I, you know, just make up, I just fantasize a story that entails that E is the case, that doesn't mean that I understand why E is the case. It has to be, there's some constraints on my explanation, right? So it has to, presumably the explanation has to be true, have to be justified in believing it, and so on. I didn't catch discussion of that aspect. Maybe I missed it. Can you shed light on that?
Understanding why. Let me make sure I understand. So the concern is that the reason is made up, that the necessity is made up. Could you just repeat?
The necessity is genuine. You know, it's like just logical entailment. It's just that this, I made up the story. So why did the rock fall? Well, because it has, you know, fallingness in it, and fallingness, you know, just stipulate means that it falls, and, you know, something like that.
But then, okay, good. So then am I really grasping the connection between the necessity and the real world? So I guess, sorry, I was late for your talk. Can I be grasping it if it's not real? It seems like then I'm not grasping the connection, because what I'm grasping isn't the real connection at all.
Okay, so maybe that's the bit that I missed. So you wanted to say that because on the thesis that was on the slide I was referring to, it was tentative. But yeah, so that's what you mean by grasping the connection between the real world and the explanation. Explanation has to be true, like if you think of it on the kind of the end model, the claims are true.
I don't want to use the word explanation because I don't want to beg the question against Lipton, but whatever the connection is between the necessity claim and the, it doesn't have to be that the necessity claim explains what's going on in the actuality claim. It could just be that, again, it could be that it is just some sort of logical entailment that you understand. But otherwise, yes.
Yeah, so I was mostly worried about not the logical relation between the reason, right? Mm-hmm. But and the explanandum. I'm going to use this term.
Yeah,
but the status that the explanation has for you, like you have to have knowledge of it, you have to understand it. It seems to me that problems recur is kind of what I'm worried about. In trying to fill in the account.
So the two versions I'm thinking of are that you have to grasp it. So again, I wish I'm traveling today. That's why I missed all but the end of your talk. So you can probably tell me, or that you have to understand it. Now that raises the question of whether understanding is factive, which I don't want to get into here if I can avoid it. I mean, I see your concern. I'm having trouble cashing out an example where it would actually cause trouble, where you meet the criteria for understanding, for grasping the necessity claim, grasping the link, but failing to understand the actuality claim. And if I can't find an example that gets the first two antecedents and I don't get the consequent, then it doesn't hurt me that much, I think. But it's a good point. Is that, am I getting you?
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Okay.
I'll let someone else speak.
Okay, thanks so much, David and Daniel, for answering. Next up, we have a question from Vladimir. Vladi, please go ahead.
Thank you a lot. Actually, I wanted to ask something kind of similar to what David asked. If we have some not just justifiable reasons to explain something, didn't we had actually not an understanding, but just a sense of understanding? For instance, in that thought experiment with Baker and Abel, yes, we as the spectators of the boxing competition can think that we understand why Baker was defeated, but actually we just have the feeling of understanding because we know the information that he should have fallen in the 10th round, etc. Or we are just saw that he was punched in the face in the 5th round, and that's for us suffice as explanation. But actually, isn't that just well, anything can be used for us to get the feeling of understanding without actually understanding?
Are you thinking of Lipton's case or my variant theological case?
Well, I address Lipton's case first of all.
I think in Lipton's case, you're absolutely right, potentially. And I think that's one of the reasons Lipton's wrong to think that we understand, that we think we understand, but there's a lot more going on that we don't know about. So even if we have a sense of understanding, it's just based on a false belief. So I think that's absolutely correct. I think in my modified case, if what you understand is he lost because he had to lose, and he really did have to lose as a matter of, let's call it theological necessity, then I think it's not just a sense of understanding. I think then you really do understand. I think in Lipton's original case, you're absolutely right. Even if you think you understand, you don't, because there's lots of stuff going on you don't know about.
Without leaping further into theological discussion, I find it's also troubling without the divine example of this argument, because the understanding occurs in us, not the God or the natural world, which that understanding, well, comes from us seeing Baker defeated by Abel, yes, and not from that we understand the natural order of things.
Okay, no, so sorry, I must have set it up wrong. So the way I was picturing the theological understanding case, and I think the way Lipton thought, so in both cases, you understand why, I always forget which is which, Baker had to lose. So you understand, so in Lipton's case, you understand that Baker was scheduled to take a fall in the 10th. So it's not that you think you understand because of the punch. You think that the punch, if anything, was irrelevant. You think that he lost because he had to lose. And Lipton says that's what gives you understanding. And Hanan's point is that maybe you think you understand because of that, but you don't really. He lost because of the punch. So it's not that the lucky punch gives you a sense of understanding. It's that the seeming necessity claim gives you a sense of understanding. My claim is that in the original case, that is not sufficient for actual understanding. But in my case, the stronger necessity is sufficient for understanding. At no point in the example is anyone thinking he lost because he was punched. Everyone is sort of can see behind the curtain and knows that he's scheduled to lose either. So I think I might have mispresented the example.
Can you please return the slide to the divine version of example?
Of course. That'd be a faster way to do this. Right, so you don't, You don't understand because, oh, here I do use knowledge, back to the last question. So maybe I'm inconsistent on that. You don't understand because you think you saw the punch. You understand because you know you are a good theologian and you know, look, he had to lose. He was a sinner. This was always going to happen. And in this case, I think you're right. And again, if you're not right, then that goes against what we've, how people have interpreted the concept of theological necessity and fate for 2000 years. Assuming this is what actually happened. So assuming there really is a God and God made, and this was in the nature of God.
Okay, but we can take it for this hypothetical example. Yes. Okay. I hope I understood it correctly now.
Okay.
Okay, thanks so
Thank
much,
you.
Vladi, and thanks, Daniel, for answering. And we have a new question from Professor Bruce Russell. Bruce, please go ahead.
So I have an opposite intuition in the Baker case. Here's a third version of the boxing case. True that Baker's going to lose because he's going to have a heart attack before the fight's over. And I think there's a difference between understanding why he had to lose because he was going to have a heart attack and understanding why he lost. And that's because Abel landed a lucky punch. So I don't follow from the fact that you understand why he had to lose, heart attack. It doesn't follow that you understand why, in fact, he lost, lucky punch.
Good. That's really good. So physics, that's like almost an example of physical necessity. He did have to lose.
Yeah.
But it sort of takes away that maybe I'm baking into the divine case something about it actually being, that's really good.
Physically necessary or something.
Yeah. Hold on, let me think about that for a second. So he's gonna have a heart attack. So he's gonna lose.
I think understanding why he actually lost is because Abel landed a lucky punch. And if I don't understand that, I don't understand why he actually lost, though I understand because of the heart attack why he must have lost.
Good. So that is a good counterexample. So he had to lose as a matter of physical necessity, but that isn't why he lost. That does seem like a good counterexample. Do I understand? Because I share your intuition that then I don't understand. Because he wasn't. So maybe I'm baking into the divine case something about fate. That's cooking the books in some way. So how do I roll that out? I think you're right, humbug. So what's different about that case? Because I share your intuition. I mean, so it has to be something about how the necessity claim, and I'm just thinking out loud here because I'm kind of puzzled. How in the divine case, the necessity claim is in some way related to the loss. Whereas here it seems like it's just totally disconnected. But I have to cash that out in a non-circular way. And off the top of my head, I don't know how to do that. That seems like a really good counterexample.
Daniel, I wondered whether it really strikes at your fundamental thesis, because I don't know whether you said, so you have to help me here, that you think it's always the case if you understand that something must be the case, that you understand that it is the case. I don't know, is that?
No, I definitely don't want to say that. I mean, I mean, that's easy enough to generate counterexamples too.
Yeah.
So I don't think this necessarily destroys my thesis, but I do think it means I have to think harder about what makes that case different so that I could specify more. I think what I have now, I mean, technically, I think what I say is it's sometimes sufficient in certain cases. I definitely don't think it's always sufficient. Again, I mean, you could just be really bad at logic. You could, die before you make the inference. So it's definitely not always going to be the case. But I do think I should have something principled to say about what makes that case different from this case, because I'm getting conflicting intuitions and I don't know why. So you're right. I don't think the paper is unsalvageable, but I think I need to think more about why your case I'm getting a different intuition. Well, it has something to do, presumably, with the connection between the necessity claim and what actually happened. But I'm trying to think of how to spell that out. And I mean, I don't want to say it's because, you know, it's in this case, the necessity claim doesn't explain what happened, because then I run into lots of trouble with Lipton, and I run into lots of trouble of potentially defining in a circular way when something really generates understanding actuality. But I do want to find a way to rule out that case. I think it's probably doable, but I'd have to, I don't suppose you have an idea.
Okay. Sure.
But thank you for that. I think that's crucial.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Bruce and Daniel, for answering.
Sort of. I don't know if that counts as answering.
Oh, yeah, for the rejoinder, yeah. I just had a really quick question, and I'm just wondering, and this is going to be very quick, I promise, and fast and speedy and so on. So if we just think of something, something in the ballpark of Stephen's view, okay? So just imagine somebody gets bitten by a snake, right? And we're considering the right dosage that the cure should have, that the antidote should have, right? And were that dosage higher, you know, they'd get a heart attack, and were smaller, it wouldn't do anything for them. So there's a kind of sweet spot, that interval, that the right kind. So we understand why the antidote worked, understanding why it had to work, right? So there seem to be a lot of cases like that. So I was wondering if you could say a word or two about how your view differs from his.
So this is in which paper?
I believe this is as early as the 2006 British Journal for Phil Science paper.
About
This kind of causation as manipulation and
Variation.
counterfactual robustness, right?
I mean, so a lot of my cases don't rely on counterfactuals at all. I mean, so I think it's compatible, but I think it's, if anything, a nice extent. I mean, so in the paper, I talk a little bit more about how it extends views that I think are plausible to cases where they might not originally have been applicable. So I mean, do we understand why? So your claim is we understand why this dosage had to work because it's right in the middle. Maybe, but that's a sort of, I think that's a different kind of case. I don't think, I mean, specifically because it involves counterfactual variability, I don't think it's the same sort of case that Lipton might have had in mind, where it's really just necessity simplicator. So I mean, I think it's definitely compatible with Stephen's view, but I think it goes a little beyond that.
Okay, good. That's fantastic. So in ways, right, your view is definitely intended to apply to non-causal cases. Right?
Yes, primarily to non-causal cases. Even.
Okay. That's part of the difference. All
Yes.
right. Well, this has been absolutely thought-provoking and interesting, and thank you so much for that, Daniel. And I'm sure everybody joins me once again in for a virtual round of applause. And we're very grateful. Let's take, with everyone's permission, let's take maybe a 5 minutes break, and let's come back at 7:09 for Duncan's talk. Okay, and I'm going to stop the recording right now.